You're up. Mr. Chair, Joshua Hagmark, Water Resources Manager. I would say here for another drought update, but this is a little different focus this time. I will be talking about our supply strategies and going through our current situation, but we're also going to dive into what we need to tackle this next year. For us in the water world, October 1st is the beginning of the water year, and so we are ending the fifth year of this drought, and so starting October 1st, we will be in the sixth year. It will officially become the driest 5 years on record, smashing previous records by probably over 12 inches over that same time period, and that was our drought of record. I do have Renee Brook from our community development. She's our city planner. She's here today to talk about the development aspects of water conservation. So, thanks. There you go. So today we'll be going over the drought status, community conservation, current water supply strategy, lake and reservoir operations, drought response capital project highlights. And then we're going to dive into the two components of really water usage, which is the supply management and the demand management side of it. And then we're going to end with discussion and input. We hope to get some really meaningful information from the Water Commission that we can take to council next week. And it will be very helpful in guiding where we go next and what we bring back to you next for discussion. So, as been mentioned before, Santa Barbara County is literally the epicenter of the current drought. It basically radiates out from Santa Barbara County. I went ahead and looked at NOAA's current predictions for January through March, our normally wettest time, and they are calling for below average rainfall. Again, we take this with a grain of salt. Last year they were saying we were going to get above average rainfall, but certainly this is not an optimistic outlook given our current water supply situation. On the brighter side, we saw 42% conservation from our community in August, which is outstanding, particularly what we're going to be talking about today. And that brings our cumulative average to 36%. And what I hope to be talking about in the future, a 12-month running average. I think we're to the point now we need to be talking about our 12-month running average. We're going to be looking to move our 12-month running average from 35% to 40%. We believe that's going to be the target we need to achieve to ensure that we have adequate supplies going forward under the current water supply conditions. So we have added to our graphic here. We are, as of October 1st, we will be entering year 6 of this drought. And what we, in good practice, we've added year 8 to the list. So we're looking 2 years out. We've actually done very good with our water supply planning in the sense of water purchases. We do recognize a shortage out there 2 years out. But at this time, we have adequate supplies to meet demands overall. But what I'm going to get to is that we do have some conveyance constraints. And that's what I've highlighted in this graphic here, which shows our monthly usage. And there's a lot of information here showing the various supplies in every month. But what we're focused on right now is August, September, and October of 2017, this coming water year. We are recognizing what amounts to about a 300 acre-foot shortage, basically where we have adequate supplies, but we cannot get them all here. We cannot pull it out of the ground, and we can't convey it from other sources outside of the area to meet all of our peak demands. And so we are focused on trying to address that, and we believe we need to move forward. We can't just wait until next spring to do that. We need to start moving forward on this now. And here's kind of the driver behind that. This blue line represents the volume of water the city itself has in storage in Cachuma. And you will notice it's basically been on a decline but it is plummeting. And we basically, come January, we anticipate having no water in storage, which is another first. And the challenge with that is currently the state water system is planned to go offline for about 2 to 3 weeks for maintenance in January. Ray Stokes, the general manager or director for CCWA, is pushing hard to get that suspended. They are going to try in November and do some of this work with the facilities in operation. And if they can get it done, then they can cancel that January shutdown. We're hopeful that they can do that, because if they can, then that will mean we can be able to pump water into the lake in January and keep some level of storage in Cachuma.
A couple questions on the water supply. I noticed we're assuming 30% state water allocation going forward. For a few years, we were assuming 0 state water allocation. How did we go from 0 back to 35?
Commissioner Burney, given that the reservoirs in Northern California all seem to be in really good shape at this point, we feel fairly confident that we will be getting some allocation, and so we made. I thought 0 was a little too conservative. I think we'll see some out of this. The initial 0 was because the state really got caught off guard with its storage of water in reservoirs, but I think they've gotten a better handle on it now, and so I think it's reasonable to expect some delivery.
Okay. And then my other question, over the last few years, you've done a fantastic job of essentially borrowing other people's capacity when it's available. Is that part of the plan? How likely do we think that's going to be to kind of take care of this shortfall that we're seeing, or have things changed?
Yeah, things have gotten considerably worse, and I'll talk about it some more later in my presentation, but we do not believe there will be excess capacity. Given the condition of the lake, both Carpinteria and Montecito are going to be utilizing their full capacity in the pipeline, and so we don't see an opportunity like we have seen in the past for that excess water delivery.
Is the shutdown on the State Water Project, is that CCWA, or is that further north?
It's the entire system. They just general maintenance that they do, but they normally do it in November. It's kind of a yearly thing that they do. They're going to try and do a lot of this maintenance while the system is up in November, and if they can't, there's a lot of pressure to take it down and do it. Obviously, we want the system to be reliable. That's a primary focus. We cannot have it going down in the summer. That would be catastrophic. But if they can complete the maintenance in November with it operating, that would be immensely helpful. That would allow us to deliver a couple hundred acre feet more to the lake in January. So Lake Cachuma sits at 14,468 acre feet, which is about 7.5% of capacity. The barge was located June 28th and 29th to its new location, just in time for the downstream release, which began on July 12th. We had been anticipating a release of about 8,000 acre feet over the 6 to 8 week period. The release actually ended up being just over, almost 12,000 acre feet, and wrapped up at the end on August 29th. The lake elevation we thought was going to drop by a little over 10 feet, dropped by about 16 feet. There was a lot of challenges with this situation, and probably read about it in the paper, but there was a clause in a 1973 State Water Rights Order that gave the downstream users the ability to do a negative water release, something they had never done before, something we had never discussed before, and something they did not share with us that they were planning to do, nor did the Bureau. And so it wasn't until mid-August that we got a very cryptic email from the Bureau stating that it wasn't even very clear that the release was going to go on. We thought it was going to wrap up in mid-August, and we called an all-hands meeting. City attorney was on the phone. We listened to their description of this and they part of the order that they were planning to use. and obviously did our homework, and unfortunately it appeared to be legal what they were doing. Just I think when it comes down to the fact that the lack of communication, I mean, we've been meeting monthly with a lot of these folks. We share our information about what our needs are and demands are, so we don't have any surprises exactly like this. We can't afford it at this point, and so that was really probably the greatest failure of this. And we do have a meeting today, this afternoon, with the Bureau and the downstream users to discuss how and why this happened and how we might build relationships going forward after this, because this is a pretty significant breakdown in communication.
So where does that water come from?
That's a very good question. The Bureau, if you ask them, it comes from negative credits. And I said, well, what is a negative credit? It is the minimum pool. It's the minimum pool that the Bureau has stood by and said, no one will use the minimum pool. It is at the Bureau's discretion when this water gets used, and no one's going to use it. We even went on the record because the downstream users were afraid we were going to use it and stated the city has no intent of using the minimum pool, and made that very clear in writing, because there was a lot of public discussion that's why we were moving the bar, just so we could steal the minimum pool. When in reality that was their plan, and that was what was very unfortunate about the whole situation. I hope that answers your question.
So you might get to this, but I mean, what is the implication then for us?
And I do have we will get that at that. So where does this leave the fish? We are at the point right now, and again, the Bureau is the lead on this, but they have installed 4 or 5,000 gallon tanks and are filling these by truck because we don't have the ability to pump water to the Hilton Creek. We were pushing very hard to get these fish relocated to a hatchery where we could ensure their safety, but NIMS refused to allow the fish to be moved. They wanted them to stay in the watershed. They wanted them specifically to stay in Hilton Creek. We had even come up with a temporary hatchery of sorts where they could stay in San Ynez. We had been working with ID1. They had located a property owner and a way to move these fish and safely store them in. So they kept getting San Ynez water because that's the imprinting that goes on. And unfortunately, this has been just, in my mind, a massive failure of organizations to come together. At times, I feel NIMS really wants this to fail so they can point to this as, see, you guys aren't doing a good job trying to manage the fish. But at this time, the few fish that do remain in Hilton Creek are being fed by trucks, basically. So this is how the county and Bureau have decided to portray what remains in the lake. There is carryover water, which the city owns a significant share of that. I think we're somewhere around 2,000 acre-feet of that amount. Then there is imported water. We are currently carrying about 600 acre-feet of that amount is the cities that we have imported and not used yet. Then there is this B&A A&A account, and I've talked about this before, and I don't want to get too lost in the definitions, but it's basically below narrows and above narrows. It's basically 2 accounts that the downstream users hold water in, and the reason, how do I want to do this, just to keep it simple, because they released water and it didn't make it to the below narrows account, this 1973 state order gave them the ability to release 2,000 acre-feet in addition to that water. And so that's where they ended up with this larger release. And they show the lake here at 0, and then there's this negative part. Well, this negative part really came out of the minimum pool. And the minimum pool that was sacred to the Bureau at keeping it 12,000 acre-feet is really now somewhere in the 7,000 acre-foot range. And that's what is really just unfortunate to this whole discussion.
Is there a chance that when we get to that 12,000 threshold that they don't allow us to take any more water? Or do they understand that there's that gap between 12,000 and 7,000?
Well, that's the challenge. We have our accounts that we're planning on using, and that's what's difficult about this. Now, on a monthly basis from here on out, there will be about 200 to 300 acre feet of inflow into the reservoir that will start to go to filling this negative, which likely, if all things work out by next spring, hopefully the negative is gone. That's the best case scenario. But here's just a comparison. This is what we knew in June. I believe this was June 30th. We had carryover water at just over 6,000. We had a little bit of imported water stored in the lake. The downstream users had a total in storage of 7,800 acre feet. And so we were anticipating a release of somewhere around 8,000 because this account does continue to grow every month. And then we had the minimum pool. And then we ended up with this, which is a minimum pool with now 7,300 in it, this negative that they're carrying on the books. And then, of course, the imported and carryover water. Where does that put the lake? We, as you recall, at this spring, we entered in uncharted territory. The last significant drought of record in the 90s, we had the miracle month of March, where we received 23 inches of rain and got a little bump here of about 47,000 acre feet of runoff into the reservoir. We missed that. Didn't happen. And so we are now in very much uncharted territories. I think it was interesting to note that 23-inch rain event, which occurred basically in 1 month, only put 47,000 acre feet of water into the reservoir. That was pretty significant and startling. And so we don't anticipate that there is really a rainfall event this winter that will fill the lake. We are hoping for just something to at least improve the situation. So this was a picture I showed everyone in spring. It was there's our intake tower. There's where the barge was. There's where the current barge is. You can see how far offshore it is. And then the picture that Kathy showed you, there's the hole that we had dug out, dredged before we put the barge in. And it quickly is now completely dry. And our barge is sitting here and getting closer to shore. And just wanting to point out, here's where our state water comes in. The distance between the state water and the current barge is about 10,000 feet, which is the same distance currently from the barge to Tecolote Tunnel. So it'd be basically doubling the length of the pipe. We did meet yesterday with COMB and their consultant, and it looks like if we don't get adequate inflow, a pipeline extension from the dam to the barge would not be necessary until the spring of 2018. That was very helpful information to know. It was updated with all the latest information we have, assuming no more surprises, which means we do still have some time, I think, to hold off on design and planning for this pipeline extension. We believe we have until at least next spring to kick that discussion around. But as I think was brought up by Commissioner Jordan, the ability to store water in this lake to meet those peak demands is really important. And so how to preserve that when we do start to get down to that level is important. So I apologize for the small font, but I just wanted to cover this quickly. The State Water Rights Order, this is something we have been waiting for pushing 15 years, I think, was finally issued. A draft was finally issued on September 9th. And we are working with CCRB and its member agencies of Montecito and Goleta. And the CCRB team of biologists and hydrologists to provide comments by the October 25th due date. This is going to be a push for us. Our main focus is to review the effects of the invasive species. Ultimately the whole intent here was to restore steelhead habitat. We continue to be plagued by bass who thrive in warm water and are a natural predator of steelhead. And there are many other predators actually along the river that have made recovery of the steelhead difficult. But we will be commenting on that, and we are evaluating what the impacts are of the State Water Rights Order. It isn't what we had hoped for, but it also isn't exactly what other agencies were hoping for either. It was, we call it a hybrid. And so we do need to do some modeling to understand what the water supply impacts are from that. CCRB and the city are committed to protecting the primary supplies for communities throughout the region in coastal agriculture and important environmental priorities. We do look forward to commenting on the draft, and keeping in mind we have to work with the State Water Resources Control Board, the Bureau. There will be Cal Trout, there will be NIMS. Everyone will be commenting on this document. And so there are downstream users will be commenting on it, and to remind everyone that our efforts to date we've been investing nearly $2 million a year in trying to restore steelhead habitat along the San Ynez River. It's a significant investment. We have removed barriers along 14 miles of creeks and tributaries feeding the river. And we continue to try and remove barriers and increase passage. But it is definitely challenging, particularly in these dry climates. I'm guessing 100 years ago the steelhead would just hang out in the ocean and wait for the water to actually come back. But we have some fish hanging on that we're trying to maintain, the few that are here. And then, of course, monitoring and evaluating the steelhead health is a key component. Is there any questions about the State Water Rights Order? Okay. Gibraltar.
What's your process for the comments?
Putting our comments together is going to move fairly quickly. There is a potential that it could be a extension could be granted, but we aren't guaranteed. So we really are focused on the 25th, and our comments will be coming from CCRB.
That was my question.
And shared with council and commission.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So Gibraltar, as Kathy, and just move to this really quick, we will be doing a release. I just want to make sure that the Water Commission knows about this because it will probably get out into the public as well, we will be doing a release. It is part of a release we have to do as part of a Jin Chow settlement, but it will also, we're also just going to go ahead and let the remaining water in the lake go in the hopes, and this is what happened last year, we had a couple 100 acre feet in there, we got about 1,000 acre feet of inflow, but we still, when we bring it down, we just we were not getting the numbers we needed for water quality to feel comfortable with the water quality, and so we stopped taking it. And so our hopes by cleaning out the reservoir at this point is that when we do get some inflow this winter, it will be water we can use. This water has just basically been in here distilling, evaporating, and concentrating itself, and leading to a very high TOC. And then as Kathy had mentioned earlier, the Ray Fire and its diminishment of capacity in Gibraltar is a major concern that we're going to be looking at. And just one more thing we really didn't need to worry about. Drought response capital, I do going to report that all 8 of our wells are up and running. We continue to monitor for seawater intrusion, and we are going to be increasing the frequency of that monitoring. We have been working with USGS to get that going, and so far we've been fortunate, but I don't expect that luck to last long, and our supply planning takes that into consideration.
In cooperation with Council Member White, we reviewed the hydrogeology of the Foothill Basin, and it appears that there's about something like 100 or 150 feet of aquifer thickness below the deepest wells out there. The hydrogeologist Robert Marks felt that it would not be efficient to try and drill deeper into there, but if things continue to get worse, it might be something we'd want to revisit. And that aquifer or that basin has the advantage it's not connected to the ocean, so we don't have seawater intrusion, so that may come back to haunt us.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we've made some assumptions that we will be seeing. We consider this year peak water. We considered 2016 to be peak water year from our groundwater, and we do our planning for diminished capacity going forward. Desal, just really quick, running through, the structural foundations are complete. Major underground is complete. The treatment trains have been placed in, and we've just recently gotten power, and they are testing the equipment. The biggest threat right now remains the intake pipe. There are critical components we shared in a presentation with council. There are critical transition pieces where the power and communication lines that go out to the pumps in the ocean have the potential to delay this project. They're very custom pieces, and unfortunately, our predecessors, when they did this project, go as far as duct tape and baling wire, but they were throwing it together quickly. There was an emergency then, and they cut some corners that are now kind of biting us. And so we're trying to make it right and fix it, but it is throwing up one of the most significant challenges, and this is something our construction manager is watching closely. We do have approval to work in the ocean, though, and we do have divers out there on a regular basis now installing equipment. But we will keep the Water Commission up to date on changes to the schedule. But right now, the operational plan is January 25th of 2017 is when we plan to be in production. One of the biggest challenges, there's about 42 days that it takes to ripen these filters, growing bacteria on the filters so that you get adequate treatment. It's kind of an interesting process. And so basically 42 days before January 25th is when we hope to be bringing seawater on shore and running it through the filters. We are working to see if there's anything we can't do to expedite and shorten that period. And so that's what we're focused on as well.
When we met in July, the potential start date or the expected start date was October, November. Now we're at January. What happened?
Commissioner Burney, the big trip was these transition pieces. We initially pressure tested them, and far below their design pressure, they started to leak. And rather than go ahead and hope that they would hold, we moved forward with replacing them. It was also challenging because these communication and power lines that actually run through the feed line, they basically transition in and out. They just poured them in concrete as they go in and out, so it didn't allow us to pull them out, which is the plan, was to pull out the old wires and put in the new. And so that was the other part that kind of fed into this, why we need to do these transition pieces. And so unfortunately, they're very custom. And we're fortunate to have IDE and Kiewit in their global reach, but it's still been difficult to get those custom pieces made. We just had one arrive, and we have 4 to make.
And so as we, obviously, we want to ensure that this plant is viable long term. So what are we doing now that's different than what we did a few years, 20 years ago with the original plant, so that we can continue to use this desal plant going forward?
So yes, the transition pieces that we're planning to use will allow wires to be pulled in and out and upgraded, and not the just bury it in concrete method that was used before. So this takes us to our discussion today, and in particular about how do we get the community now to achieve a constant 40% conservation. And what we have before you is what we would kind of are proposing, which is moving to this 40% conservation. We are currently in year 5, and we'll wrap that up shortly and be into year 6. With 40% conservation, you'll notice that the additional need for new supplies kind of goes away in year 8. And it also addresses that peaking issue that I had mentioned earlier, because we're allowed to build up kind of additional supplies in Cachuma to help us meet those peak needs. We've been very successful this last year in acquiring imported water. In fact, we got our Dudley Ridge bank water back. We purchased 4,000 acre feet, and our state water allocation this year was almost 2,000, giving us a total of 7,265 acre feet of water. And as you may recall, we have the capacity to deliver 3,300 acre feet a year. This year will be more than that because we were able to take advantage of excess capacity. I do not have that number today, but it'll probably be in the 4,000 acre foot range. We don't anticipate that going forward, and so we are planning around a 3,300 acre foot number. Certainly, we will take advantage of excess capacity if we get it. So, as I mentioned earlier, Cachuma carryover water and storage is anticipated to be exhausted by December of this year. Cachuma to play a key role in the storage and conveyance of our imported water. Conveyance of imported water through Cachuma is expected to require bypass piping by the spring of 2018. Groundwater peak production in 2016, and we are planning for a decline in production. We continue to watch seawater intrusion, and we have worked up a plan for what wells we will idle when we start to see those elevated numbers go up. Desal current production anticipated in late January. But as I'd mentioned, there are vulnerabilities to that construction that has us very concerned. And one of the reasons in our discussion today why we believe we need to be planning for a contingency. Our imported water delivery constraints, as we had mentioned, and the anticipated supply shortfall if we continue to stay with our 35% conservation. So this takes us to the demand management side of this, in particular the regulations that the city can implement to try and achieve additional conservation. So as I mentioned, we are currently, our cumulative average is at 36%. The state has kind of backed off because a good portion of the state is not experiencing drought conditions, so they're not requesting any additional regulations. But we are facing a worsening water supply situation. Things have not improved, and based on NOAA's forecasts, we don't see things improving, and so we believe we need to continue to be planning for the worst. City regulations, we are projected to have a 300 acre foot shortfall in the summer of 2017. We also believe strongly that we need to reestablish a contingency supply, and we believe it needs to be a minimum of 500 acre feet. We have in our supply planning always had some contingency planning. I'll just be honest with you, that contingency planning is gone. We just do not have it anymore. And we believe we need to rebuild it, and the way to rebuild it is through additional conservation. Our goal is to protect the community's investment in trees and shrubs, to minimize impacts to the economic activity in the community, and to generate 800 acre feet of net savings. A general ban on irrigation of turf grass has been estimated to save between 500 and 1,200 acre feet a year. We feel those numbers, it's very difficult to guess at this point because a lot of people have already let their lawns go. And it's difficult to know how many people will comply with this. It's not going to be something we can go into people's backyards and check. And so that's why you see the range. My gut tells me, based on what we've seen from this community, it will probably be closer to 1,000 is what we see, just based on the support from this community, the engagement, and the understanding of the concerns that we're facing. So I do believe the 500 is on the low end, but we wanted to give a range because there is some uncertainty to that. Now, elements of a proposed ban on irrigation of turf would include, we had residential exemptions when incidental to irrigation of the drip line of trees and shrubs. We're working through these issues now. Now, this is the kind of stuff we're going to look for feedback from the Water Commission at the end. We're working with parks right now on trying to come up with information that we can give out to the public. Our preference would be for people to use soaker hoses to water their trees, not sprinklers. We're really trying to get away from sprinklers. It's just a really inefficient way to apply water, in particular at this time. And then watering of certified water-wise grasses. We have been promoting and providing rebates on grasses that use about 30% of what normal turf grass uses. and we want to continue with that, which means we know who all those homeowners are, and so we would need to go through and certify their grasses. So, and give them, they'd get little placards that they'd have to put up and display, but at least we'd know who they were, because their grasses really need to be watered maybe once a month, if that, and that is something that we would be promoting in the community. Institutional exemptions, irrigation at publicly owned and operated parks and recreations and open spaces. We do believe it is still important. A lot of people live in dense housing, and so their only outdoor spaces are public parks and schools, and we do believe that that is still a good use of water at this time. And so continuing to exempt those. Again, a lot of our parks and schools are already irrigated with recycled water. There are just a handful, it's a minority actually, that still use potable water, and it's because they're just a long ways from the recycled water system.
Are there any golf courses being watered with potable water right now?
Not within the city. All city golf courses are supplied with recycled water. Like we had talked about earlier, La Cumbre Country Club is currently still watered with potable. They're very interested in getting access to our recycled water, and when it's available, we would love to make that available to them.
Sure. Are they getting potable water from La Cumbre Mutual?
Yes.
Okay.
And then areas, active recreation at schools, daycare facilities, and after-school programs. We just, again, this is we've talked about this before. These kind of facilities really, in the big picture, are not big water users. And I think there's a greater public good to allowing some of this to move forward. But again, we're looking for comments and feedback. Commercial exemptions, turf areas directly related to business activities, ceremonial event spaces. We are contemplating exempting those, again, focused really on just grass that no one uses, no one recreates on. That's the stuff that we really want to go after. If it does have a significant value, and we will have a process where we go through and they explain what they're doing, and we will be looking for how they are trying to, on that property, meet the 40% conservation as a whole, even if they need to water that turf. So this is kind of what we're laying out for turf grass. I want to kind of keep going, and then we can talk about all of this at the end. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Brooke to kind of walk you through what new development means to the community.
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you, commissioners. As Joshua mentioned, he covered potential savings for water use and existing development, and what I'll talk about is new development coming online in the city. And what we are seeing in terms of projects under construction at this point, some are a backlog of projects that were approved many years ago, and with the recovery of the economy are now being constructed. So they might have received their approvals quite some time ago. And because of that, it is of a strong interest in the community. We've had discussions with City Council 3 times and Planning Commission once over the last 2 years about the water demand added by new development. And as Joshua mentioned, during normal years, our water demand is about 14,600 acre-feet per year. During our current condition, our target is 9,500 acre-feet per year. When we've looked back over the last 10 years of new development, we found that new development only amounts to an average of 27 acre-feet per year. And part of that is because we're seeing in a built-out city, most of our lots are being redeveloped. So it's a net new water demand. There's existing development on the site that's demanding water, and then the new development is only, on average in a year, demanding another 27 acre-feet. When we look at the gross demand in the pipeline, those are projects that are pending approval or have received their land use entitlements, but not yet their building permit. All of those projects, which there's about 130 of them, total 179 acre-feet per year. And if we look at past trends, we see that typically only about half of those projects actually get constructed. For any number of reasons, they don't go forward. And we also see them constructed over a number of years. So while we talk about 179 acre-feet per year with pending and approved projects, it's important to understand that all of that demand for water won't come at once, and it may not come at all. But we will obviously continue to see new projects proposed where that number will fluctuate over the years. What this graph shows is our historical water demand for new development going back to 2006, and you see it varies from year to year. But our 10-year average, again, with that orange line, is about 27 acre-feet per year. And this just shows in a chart the 179 acre-feet per year that I mentioned that accounts for all pending and approved projects. And then when we've had these past discussions with City Council and the Planning Commission, they have on every occasion determined that the quantity of savings that could be found by restricting new development, restricting issuance of building permits, or placing some kind of a moratorium on development, they found that the savings is well short of our projected supply shortfall. And again, that is on average about 27 acre-feet per year, with the worst case scenario of what we're seeing in the pipeline right now of 179. Also, as Joshua mentioned, our shortfall in 2017, if we restricted development at this point, we wouldn't necessarily see that savings in time for next summer, because it does take time to go through the building permit phase and construction and actually begin to demand that water. It would likely have significant economic impacts on our construction industry and others who, may be living in these new projects. And it's important to note that any new construction would be subject to the same water use regulations as existing customers. So if it comes to turf or installation of landscaping, all these new projects need to comply with not only our adopted standards for low water use landscape plans, but whatever types of water use restrictions are in place. I think it's...
So as far as schedule, we believe we need to be adopting restrictions on turfgrass watering as early as November of 2016. We believe we need to start now to maximize savings. Winter rainfall, we believe, will help to smooth this transition. Even if we get rainfall based on past years, it'd be enough to probably keep most people's lawns alive without watering, and really shouldn't be watering lawns in the winter here anyway. It achieves full implementation by start of 2017, and I think that's the most important. We just can't afford to trip and stumble, and so I think having the community ready, having our enforcement ready, and the ability as soon as the 2017 irrigation season starts, we are ready to start recognizing significant savings is an important part of that. Puts the city in the best possible position for potential year 6 of the drought. And, if we do get, considerable rainfall, easily any Tuesday could be adjusted and restored fairly easily. We could put that back or remove that restriction. And so that's primarily why we feel like we need to move forward on this quickly. Budget, expect added revenue losses with the new regulations. We've very preliminary numbers believe that moving from a 35 to a 40% conservation will be about a $3.2 million loss for a full fiscal year. Since this is halfway through, it'd be about a $1.6 million loss. So our options are additional use of reserves. As you know, we're planning to use about $7 million from reserves this year already. So that's obviously one aspect to consider, but do we just go ahead and absorb those costs this year, and then, or do we consider a drought impact fee? This fee is to basically offset the revenue loss that we just talked about. It'd be a fixed amount over all units of water sold, and it's very similar to what surrounding agencies have implemented. So we'll be exploring this, and we'd welcome any feedback when we get done on that. Enforcement, I want to make sure everyone's aware of this, and for those like Mr. Keller who were around, Commissioner Keller, who were around last time, the enforcement is a touchy subject, but We believe we do need to have enforcement for us to be successful at meeting our goals. This would include staff patrolling during key outdoor watering times. The violations process has already been defined in our municipal code. There basically are 4 offenses, starting with a warning. And again, these are in play right now for offenses of water wasting. And we have found nobody really moves beyond offense number 1. Most people are happy to be notified. Thank you for letting me know that that's on. We've had great feedback. Our staff take a very personal approach to it. And so we have never gone through a second offense. However, it needs to be known that this is a lot more drastic and likely that we might see some of this. But this is how our fines work out. It's $250 fine in a 12-month period, followed by a 3rd offense, which could include a flow restrictor, and a 4th offense, which could mean shutting the water off. Other water-saving measures that are out there is rationing, basically putting every customer on a budget. This is what the city of Santa Cruz implemented. It does take a significant amount of staff resources. We'd probably be bringing in consultants to support us to develop individual customer budgets. And then, of course, the time to manage that. There's typically a school that you can go through to get your first offense waived, but anticipate that going and establishing a rationing program will take us about 12 months to develop. We are open and listening to Water Commission and the public. What other water use restrictions do they believe we have not mentioned or should be considering? And we also wanted to note that we want to continue with rebates for turf grass removal. Some of this may be counterintuitive, but we believe it's part of the long-term plan. When people do tear out water wasting landscaping and put in drought tolerant stuff, it does take water to get established. However, we believe it would get this community on the right path if people have an opportunity and a rebate to remove their grass, which they currently do have now, but wanting to continue to move forward with that, where they can take out their grass and put in native landscaping. It will probably continue to demand some water, but when this drought is over, as a community, we will be in a better position. And so we feel strongly about continuing to support the rebates for that as well. So that leads us to our Water Commission discussion and input, and I did get confirmation that we have the room until 10:30, so we can take some more time to continue to discuss this. But we are looking for input on turf grass watering restrictions, potential exemptions and enforcement concerns, development restrictions, drought impact fee, other water saving measures, rationing, water use restrictions, and rebates. I'd like to open it up to the Commission.
Who wants to start? Okay. Mr. Jordan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I know we're short on time, so generally everything that you've portrayed up there I'm generally in agreement with. A couple things I find, and then what I find missing there from my perspective, one is, again, back to a plan as part of this to recapture the maximum amount feasible of discharge water. So, that's still we're discharging water and still having to go out and buy replacement water for that water we're discharging. And so I know that's another conversation, but I still think that needs to be a big tool in the toolbox. One of the exemptions I didn't see on there was exempting right-of-way trees. You talk about parks, schools, other things like that, but I don't see anything specifically for street-side trees that would exempt me from running out there and doing what I do now in the middle of the night, putting a hose out to the trees on the parkway and making sure they keep getting water.
All trees, Commissioner Jordan, all trees and shrubs would be exempt from
all of
this.
Them?
Yes.
Okay.
You could water those with
and then you talk about continuing rebates possibly. I'd also like to see some more talk in there maybe with creeks about low-impact development opportunities in any capital projects, whether public capital or private capital projects, specifically for right-of-way or other ways to recapture water for new commercial development that would then feed your even lower need water for your landscaping. So even if you do go to a low water landscape, you still have a water need. Why are you using potable water? Why are you not recapturing water from going down the street or coming off your roof or wherever it may be? And what are we doing to encourage that other than putting out a design book somewhere and hoping people utilize that? But why aren't we requiring that, and maybe also feeding it a little bit with a little bit of rebate? I see the tunnel's gone on grass for me. I think that the future is finding a way to grab every bit of water that comes down from whatever source it is, discharge, rain, wherever it is, and continue to utilize it. So, thank you.
All right, Ms. Birdie.
Thank you. In general, as Mr. Jordan said, in general agreement with everything that you have specifically around turfgrass restrictions. I think that's been a long time coming, and it's really time to implement that for our community. You got at this, but I really want to make sure that we're emphasizing this when we talk about exemptions. Just because somebody or a business or a public institute might be exempt from the turfgrass restrictions, they're not exempt from the 40% conservation. And I think that messaging to the public is going to be really important. Mm-hmm. That yes, we do think it's important for especially public places to have some recreation, but it doesn't mean that those people or those institutions are exempt from the conservation goal, just that specific restriction. I think that type of language would go far for people who have concerns around any type of turf. Likewise, the one thing I guess I'd disagree with would be rebates for turfgrass removal. If we're not allowing people to water turfgrass, we shouldn't then be paying them to remove it. I think we should continue to have rebates for native gardens, and as Commissioner Jordan mentioned, things like water recapture on site, those things that we're trying to emphasize. But I think it might be time to sunset that rebate for turfgrass removal itself.
Maybe I should clarify, it'd be a removal of the turfgrass and replacement with a water garden or native landscaping. That'd be the intent. Okay, so then maybe it's just, again, a language and messaging thing that we aren't paying people to take out their turfgrass. We're helping them transition to more sustainable. Drought impact fees, I know, are unpopular, but I also realize given the state of our or the lack of our reserves, it's probably time to look at that. And I'm not sure about moving into rationing just yet. I think I'd like to see what happens since the community has been so responsive to our other requests for savings before we move into rationing. I'd like to give the community time to respond since they've done such a fantastic job over the last 5 years of doing so. But in general, appreciate your work on this, both on the restrictions and on the development side.
Mr. Chair, I agree, again, with comments made by both other commissioners. Generally support everything that you've laid out. I do, with Ms. Verney, support the drought impact fees. I just think that it's really time, and it also it's messaging. There's a big messaging issue that we have here. You get questions in the line. I get the questions, well, when Desal comes on, the restrictions are going to get lifted. There is a perception that, in fact, Desal is going to solve the day rather than plug the gap. So we have a lot of messaging issue. And again, I'll just go to the big one, and that is people are going to be very upset that, in fact, they have to do further rationing. They can't water their lawns, and yet new development's coming up out of the ground. That is going to be a perception issue. I sit on the fence on the issue because, in fact, the community has responded so well, as commented on. And, again, you have to basically go with the fact that they've been responsive to the emergency that we're in and give them the benefit of the doubt before we would take that step. I think that it's going to be a difficult messaging issue. The last slide talked about, we can adjust if, in fact, things get better. it looks as if we're now kind of planning on a year-by-year basis. Well, we could make it through the next year. We can make it through the next year, all hoping that, in fact, the drought lifts. But, in fact, in terms of the planning issue, again, I get a little bit more concerned that we're at the, you say, no contingencies, there's no thresholds left, no margin left, that if, in fact, the drought intensifies, if, in fact, the conservation efforts don't reach the 40% averages, if, in fact, the state water issues don't basically supply 30%, we're on real thin margins for next year and the year after, and that red margin isn't 3 years out, it's 2 years out or whatever. So the issue on development, I think the jury is out relative to the average versus the bubble. I know that in the 90s, what happened at this point was a rush to the well, that people started to get worried that, in fact, they weren't going to be able to get in, and so you had a rush to the well, and that we may see more of that development than the average. So I guess I'm basically saying I will voice the concern, but I'm not ready to pull the plug on either development or rationing. But I got to tell you, I'm in that red line margin that basically it's very close for me.
I think with all these proposed possible measures, it's important to evaluate how much water can be saved by them and what the actual cost in terms of enforcement or administration might be, because all of them will clearly take more staff time, which will drive up the cost. I don't understand exactly how a drought impact fee would be implemented, whether it be based on consumption of water, some sort of percentage of water use or something like that. But somehow we'll have to pay for increased enforcement and administration of these things, and that's going to drive water rates up, whether it's an impact fee or just incorporated in the normal rates, at the same time that the water production is going down. So we need to figure out how these things balance pretty well.
And I'll just say I concur with all the comments that the commissioners have made here. I did want to just pose the question. Mr. Jordan kind of touched on this a little bit previously, but about reusing water, on site or having some sort of like gray water system. Is there any chance we can kind of impose that on new development to kind of implement or install these types of systems? Yeah, incentivize. Or, and we kind of also talked about the turf removal. I'm sure there's a pot of money for that rebate program. Is there some way we can start to integrate maybe gray water systems into that? Maybe not necessarily adding money to the fund, but kind of allocating some funds for incentives on that end.
So our rebate program right now, which is up to $1,000 per residential, does include gray water systems, and we do have some very easy to implement gray water system guidelines to help expedite things, and certainly have been working on expedited permitting for the ones that are more complex internally. So it's there. We are encouraging them. We certainly rebate people doing water gardens to try and slow water down. For new developments, there are really strict guidelines on what they can and can't plant and how much grass, turf they're allowed to have. It's really small, and in this case, they just won't be allowed to put in turf if we're in a turf ban. Mm-hmm. So I think I would say we have some of the strictest in the state when it comes to landscaping design guidelines. And, we do have the carrot approach and we have the stick approach. So we're trying both, and I think we've been successful at changing behavior, and I think that speaks to why we've been able to go so long with actually very minor regulations to get the kind of conservation that we've gotten. And that's what's tough. We're just getting to the point where the community has done a lot. We should be very proud of the community. Should be very proud of what they've done so far with very minimal regulations. And it's unfortunate. I think the commission and I regret that we have to go this far, but things just unfortunately continue to get worse. And this is, when you have a drought this of this historical significance, there really, unfortunately, isn't there isn't anything else. We've tried to push going further, as long as we can, but at this point we just can't. I think we can't wait any longer. We need to actually up the ante, and we feel to ensure that we get that 40% conservation that we need to implement this next step.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chair, excuse me, I would just add, as Joshua mentioned, the gray water system, and I'll just touch on water reuse in the form of rain. Should we get it? We are our stormwater management program does encourage, through those smaller development types, BMPs such as rain barrels and disconnecting downspouts to flow onto landscapes. So I believe more people are getting educated through that as well. And we are looking at relaxing some of our zoning standards, to allow rain barrels and setbacks, and trying to accommodate more of those solutions. But again, that does rely on rain in order for those to be effective.
Mr. Chair, so what happens if, in fact, it doesn't work? We don't get that level of conservation. The turf is on the low end rather than the high end of how much savings that we get. What's our step if, in fact, we're not seeing that type of conservation? Because if you just look at the chart, that's a large, if you will, it's a large number in terms of what we're anticipating. What happens if it doesn't, this time, we just can't make that step? What's our next action?
So our next action would be in spring, and we'll be evaluating, obviously, improvements. Hopefully we'll be talking about improvements in our water supply situation, along with how well the community has started to adapt to the outdoor watering ban. But should we be falling short and things weren't as positive as we had hoped, we'll be talking about further restrictions on outdoor water use. Maybe shrubs are out, and we're just sitting here trying to save trees at this point. I think there is a desire by this community to save those long-term investments that we have made, and I think that will be the tough discussion that we'll have to have in the spring. But I'm confident. I'm really confident, based on this what I've seen from this community so far, that this turf watering ban will get us what we need to get us through the next. And then the other part is we'll be talking about desal expansion. At this time, I don't know how we would finance that. I am working on that. I'm working to find out if there's any federal grants, disaster grants, that could help us with that. But that is our other option that we will be discussing in the spring as well.
Mr. Chair, and desal expansion would include then carrying the water up into the conduit area.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you for the update. Better keep moving along here. We'll move on to, do you have a recommendation on that? Or do you need a recommendation too?
I think you gave me the input that I needed, and I will share that with Water Commission. And I encourage you all, if you'd like to come and speak, we will be.
Is this on Tuesday's council?
This is Tuesday's council.
Okay. Thank you.
I would love your support on that. That will be helpful.
Okay, move on to the Water Resources Manager Report number 7.
All right, I'm going to